You are listening to Talking Images, the official podcast of icmforum.com. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Chris, and in this episode, Saul and I are breaking down the career of Hiroshi Teshigahara, one of the most prominent directors of the Japanese New Wave, best remembered for Woman in the Dunes from 1964. But what else has he actually done? What other titles come to mind when you hear the name Teshigahara? Perhaps The Face of Another? Maybe Pitfall? Possibly Antonio Gaudi? But what else? Woman in the Dunes is generally considered to be one of the greatest films of all time. But over at the ICM forum, the Teshigahara mania is far more intense. In our forum poll of the greatest Japanese films of all time, held back in 2021, it actually ranked, well, number one. It beat every single film made by Kurosawa, Ozu, Mizoguchi, Miyazaki. I mean, it topped the list, and by a decent margin. 49 out of 65 of the participants voted for this film, and the Teshigahara mania went deeper. The Face of Another came in 28, Pitfall landed on 107th, and his less talked about documentary Antonio Gaudi even ended up on 201st. So there is a bit of fandom on our forum, to say the least. Though it also helps that all four films were released by the Criterion Collection. But he made 4 additional feature films that very rarely get talked about. One of them was even nominated for Best Foreign Picture at the Academy Awards. So why are we not talking more about his later films? How do they compare? And are essentially all of his films suffering due to living in the shadow of Woman in the Dunes? Oh, and why does our forum seem to just love Teshigahara so much? To answer these and more questions, let me bring in my co-host and Teshigahara superfan, Saul, and just ask him in particular, because I think, as you learned from the conversation going on, that while I love a couple of Teshigahara films, I'm a bit more cold. But for you, Saul, Teshigahara is essentially one of the greatest directors of all time, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. I have Teshigahara in my all-time top 4 directors, and so for me, he's the greatest Japanese director of all time.
Oh, wow. So he really does top Kurosawa, Ozu, etc. I did not expect that, actually. That's impressive.
Yeah, it is impressive, and if any of our listeners have listened to the How We Rank Directors podcast, a lot of it goes into how I rank directors, and just in terms of consistency, I know he's got a very small output, but for what it's worth for me, he's got 6 out of 8 films that he's done are really, really great. So that consistency for me is just much better than you get from Ozu or Kurosawa or anybody else. I can't think of any other Japanese directors that are just like that consistent throughout their filmography.
What is it that speaks to you so much about his films?
Probably the number one thing for me, because I'm quite a visual person, is just that his films are generally very visually impressive. His early work especially has got a lot of experimental stuff going on, where he takes into account textures. So a lot of his work's highly textured. You've got different surfaces there, which he just captures in very vivid detail, but also the way that he frames shots tend to be really interesting, and you sort of get that more and more as you go through his 60s films, from Pitfall up to Man Without a Map, where you've got characters that are obscured by things in the foreground. He has a very voyeuristic way of capturing images, lots of reflective surfaces. So for me, most of his films are just amazing visual assaults on the senses, and actually audio-visual assaults on the senses, because his music, it's got the same composer, whose name, if I mentioned, I would end up mangling. I did almost all of his music scores, and they're just terrific, moody, almost sound effect style music scores. So all his films are really great from an audio visual perspective. But I think just even thematically, there's a lot that I like about his work. Personal identity is one of my favorite film themes. And Teshigahara's films are just constantly about that, about identity and how we perceive ourselves in the world and how we perceive our purpose in life. And even his weaker films towards the end of his filmography have sort of got that running theme of your purpose in life and how you identify yourself.
Now that's really interesting, yeah, because to be completely honest with you, I kind of thought of his career as being in at least two parts, because I saw his early films, the quick trio he made back to back of Pitfall, Woman in the Dunes, and The Face of Another, as being unified in this very eerie kind of psychologically unnerving and exhausting films of indeed identity, but also there's this kind of existentialism, I guess, where you're not really sure about what your identity is, you're not really sure what's going on or why, and they have these, they're essentially very trippy films that play with your expectations of reality. And then in his later films, I thought he took a step back from that, and I still think he does. I mean, if you go to Rikyu, Princess Go, etc., I don't think they have that quality to them. But you are very right that this kind of sense of identity is a really interesting kind of clear thread through all of his films.
Yeah, look, we'll probably get to it later in the podcast, but I do entirely agree that his last two films are less visual. Rewatching them for the podcast, I picked up on a lot of small things I didn't notice beforehand, so I could still see the Teshigahara trademarks in there, but definitely his first 6 films versus those last 2, they do feel a little bit different. For me, if he didn't have those last 2 films, because I'm this big consistency person, it'd probably be my number 2 director of all time after Kubrick.
Whoa.
Yeah, but because I am so big on the consistency there, he's number 4 for me of all time, just because those last 2 for me, even though they're very interesting, they aren't quite up there with his first 6 for me quality-wise.
Yeah, I think we'll clash quite a bit there, because I mean I like Rikyu better than some of his his earlier films, and he's not my favorite Japanese director. He's not even, well, he's definitely among the better Japanese directors for sure, but he's not in my top 100 favorite directors of all time. So definitely a bit of a divide between us here, and I think a portion of this episode will be Saul trying to oh yes, Saul reminded me in the chat here now that I told him before this that I have none of his films in my personal top 1000, which I think unsettled him for days and days and days. So I think part of this episode will be Saul trying to convince me of the power of Teshigahara. But let's go to the film that shines the brightest in his filmography. I believe this is Saul's favorite of his films as well. It's my favorite of his films. It's the one that's on the most all-time lists. And it's the one that topped our forum poll, A Woman in the Dunes. And then we'll talk about the rest of his filmography in chronological order. But I think it makes sense to just talk about this film first, just because of how big and important it is in cinema culture in general. It is a really fascinating film. It's, like I said earlier, it's a very psychological film. It's about a man who's just, I suppose you could say, going about his day on vacation. He's looking for bugs in the desert. He gets stranded because the last bus leaves. He seeks refuge at the house, only to discover that he's trapped. He's in a very strange community where all of the homes are dug down into the sand, into these essentially very, very large sand holes. A large part of their lives is about making sure that they don't get drowned by the sand. He has to climb down this long ladder to get there, and when he wakes up the next day, the ladder is gone. And no matter how much he fights, tries to convince the woman he's staying with to let him go, tries to convince the community above to let him go, they don't, and the days pass. All his escape attempts prove to be unsuccessful, and he just has to live in this strange world where his perspective of priorities start to shift. It's, like Saul mentioned, it's beautifully shot, it's incredibly visual, and in my mind, at least, Teshigahara working in black and white creates such an eerie atmosphere. He knows how to patiently build tension. There's a lot of long, quiet scenes where we simply see work itself, where we see the sand, where we see the effort against it, and we kind of get sucked into a similar complacency as our lead, and that might be part of its power as well, just the way it starts to alter our perception of time and place, and kind of understand why our lead may be giving in to this strange reality, strange new set of social rules that he's trapped by. What are your opinions on Woman in the Dunes, Saul?
First off, Chris, I'd like to say you've done a really good job selling the film and what makes it such an attractive movie. It's a shame it's not in your top 1,000, but what can we do? For me,
it's not that far away.
Okay, that's good to know. For me, it's a film that just keeps rising in my estimation. I had it around the 40 mark before I sat down to rewatch, and after the latest rewatch, it's climbed up to my all-time top 15. So it's like one of the 10 or 15 best films I think I've ever seen. So in addition to what Chris has said, I guess the other thing which probably is worth mentioning is that the guy, even though he's employed as a teacher, has got this fascination with studying bugs. Chris did mention that briefly. And what's really interesting is the way that Teshigahara films the movie. And it's sort of like we get this guy who ends up being placed under a microscope himself. You've got all these overhead shots looking down at him. There's one point where the villagers crowd around at night and they sort of flash a light down at him when they ask him to make I don't want to say unsavory, but make a request that he's not too happy with. And just the way that it's filmed with tons of close-ups, it sort of feels like he's becoming a bug under a microscope. So he's sort of being trapped, just like he's trapping the insects that he's been studying throughout his career or studying throughout his hobby. I keep changing my mind about that. And I guess what really gets to me about the film, and I think you mentioned it also a little bit, Chris, is how we see him sort of adapt to and become complacent with it. And just rewatching the film, it just sent shivers down my spine as we see how easily he gets trapped into it and how he brushes off all these things. Like the woman says, "Oh, I can do this the next day," and he's like, "Oh, well, I'm going to be leaving tomorrow," and stuff like that. He just brushes it off, doesn't even think about it when they lower him into there and the ladder disappears. Nothing actually occurs to him until it's too late. But what really drives the film, though, is how much he changes himself, how much he adapts to his new environment and sort of sees this as maybe his new purpose in life. And it's one of those films, and there are very few films like that that really get to me like that, which is why it really ranks high up for me, where I'm trying to imagine myself in his position. I'm thinking, well, look, I have got my life at the moment, but, there are stresses at work. There are things that I'm not too happy about in my neighborhood. If I actually got trapped in the dunes and had this as my life, maybe life would actually be easier. All their provisions are cared for. Anything they want, they're requested, they get fed. All they have to do is keep shifting the sand around, but he's got constant companionship. He's got no other stresses, and actually, maybe this is a better life for him. He gets really fascinated with a way of capturing water towards the end, and you sort of see the way this person who's so set on being this teacher in the city suddenly see that, well, maybe his life can be different. A lot of the visuals for me remind me of optical illusions with the way the sand dunes move. It's just an amazing effect that Teshigahara manages to capture. And when he's trying to scale out and the walls collapse back down, the whole thing is just extremely, I guess surreal is the best word that comes to mind, but it's sort of like nightmarish also. And yeah, for me, it's just an absolutely amazing, crowning achievement. It actually wasn't even my favorite Teshigahara film until this most recent rewatch. But upon rewatch, I'm going to say, yeah, this is definitely his strongest film and one that really resonates with me.
Yeah, I can see why. And obviously the fact that you're a teacher as well, you can kind of see the appeal. That must really add to the kind of reality distortion and this kind of idea of what are you going to accept? How are you going to reframe your mind aspect of your film? I guess part of the reason why it's not a top favorite for me is that it for an early portion of the film, I was a little frustrated by how little he did to get out. He has this moment at the very start where he's really actively trying to get out, but he doesn't go all the way. And I was being a bit frustrated that, he doesn't try to, build a ladder. He doesn't try to tear the house. He does at one point, but it takes him a while to get there. So I was watching the film and I was being a bit frustrated by his early reactions and thinking how I would have reacted. Now that might disappear on a rewatch, but at least this rewatch it was just a little bit frustrating seeing how he reacted early on. And the second issue I had with the film, and this is a slight issue I have with most of Teshigahara films, is that while the shots themselves are beautiful, he has this focus on filming simple acts, and he doesn't always have the same visual tension as, say, Tarkovsky or indeed Kubrick. And you're probably going to disagree with me on that, Saul, but while this film didn't really drag that long, it is around 2.5 hours, and I did feel that it was a little bit stretched, and that's an issue I have with a lot of his later films too, where I feel like it's just a little bit too leisurely paced. I'm not really drawn into everything I'm seeing.
Okay, so to respond to those 2 points there, I take your point about making a ladder, but I'm not sure what equipment in the house would exist to be able to make that possible. He does definitely try and scale the wall himself and finds out that the dunes just collapse when he does that. And I thought what he was working on for the most part was trying to convince the villagers, or at least from his point of view, that was the easiest way to get out of there, was to be able to convince them. But then again, there's actually is one point, I don't know if it's spoilerish, because I think it happens around halfway through, where he actually manages to find a way of getting up there. So he actually does manage to eventually get out there briefly, which for me is actually maybe my favorite sequence of the entire film, because he gets up there and it's at night, and he can't see anything properly, so he's just madly running around in circles. And for me, that was the most haunting, most nightmarish part of the film, that, he's suddenly all up there, but he's sort of away from the safety of his abode down below, so it's actually scarier above than being down below where he knows where everything is. But look, I can understand what you're saying, Chris, and I also understand about the pacing. It is not a thriller, so I think if you're going into it expecting, at the edge of your seat thriller where he's constantly, meeting adversities as he's trying to escape, it's not for me a film about constant escaping. It's a film about him repositioning his mind. So I can understand. And look, I did glance on my watch a few times when I was watching it, or looked at the bar to see how much was left of the film. So I'm not saying that for me it was a perfectly paced film either, but I understand the pacing of it, and I don't think I would have preferred it as a quicker pace. I'm not so sure what you mean in terms of the simple acts, and I guess I don't want to dwell on the film too much because this podcast is called Beyond Woman of the Dunes. But what I find with a lot of Teshigahara films with the simple acts is not so much the simple acts, but it's the way that he films, and I'm not sure which parts you're talking about in Dunes. But in the other films, you've got ones where, as I mentioned before, you've got 2 characters talking, but they're actually framed through a glass cabinet. So what actually makes that scene come alive is not so much the simple things that they're doing, but the way that Teshigahara places his camera to sort of make us a more active participant in what's going on. So yeah, I can't really say without more examples or more of you elaborating on it, but at the same time, I don't want to clog up the whole podcast about this when the point of the podcast is meant to be about the film is beyond Woman of the Dunes, because yes, this is arguably the best Japanese film ever made, but he made 7 other movies also, and considering film like directors like Tarkovsky, based on 8 films, is considered to be an absolute master. I think Teshigahara should be in the same league.
Yeah, very good. I mean, let's move back then. And I mean, it's impressive that Woman of the Dunes is actually his second film. So now that we go over to the continuity of doing everything on a straight chronological path, we're just jumping one film back. So a very good start, to say the least. And his debut, Pitfall, is no slouch either. It is not the same kind of lull, if you want that, but it's also about someone, shall we say, without spoiling it too much. We will have to mention it, but without spoiling it too much right now. Someone accepting their new way of existence. All right, so we can tell you that now. Yeah, so this is a bit of this is a ghost film, essentially. It is about a man who is murdered for reasons he doesn't understand. He just stands there, he looks at his corpse, and he's forced to just wander around and witness reality, witness the woman who set him up, follow the man who killed him, follow the person possibly suspected of the murder, and just try to understand what happened to him. And the kind of the tenselessness of it just lingers. And it's a very cold film, I would say. It's similarly existentialist to the previous, where it's just like a circle of existential confusion. And I don't think I can remember an other film about ghosts that's kind of made in the same way. So it's similarly trippy to Woman in the Dunes in the face of another. It's visually interesting, as Saul mentioned earlier as well. And while it's a bit more bare-boned, it certainly hits a lot of marks. So to hear back from the superfan then, what is that you love about Pitfall, Saul?
So yeah, I'll just mention with Pitfall, even though it's a film that when I've talked to people in the past, they've said try and read up as little as possible about it. It is a hard one to discuss without mentioning the fact that he gets killed, because that really drives most of the film. And I think it happens around 25 minutes in. So it happens well before the halfway mark. So if we go back to our spoiler podcast, I think that's something we mentioned. Happens in the first half. Can it really be considered a spoiler? So yeah, the film for me is about him grappling with his own death and how little he can do about it. So it's actually very similar to Woman of the Dunes in the way that Woman of the Dunes, he gets trapped down there and he finds he has no way of escaping, get back up there. In Pitfall, he gets murdered and he finds that he actually has absolutely no way of finding out why it happened, or finding any way of getting revenge or getting any sort of vengeance in there. So it's very different to Ghost, the Patrick Swayze film, which will probably be I don't want to say it's the best comparison piece, but it's sort of, that's another film about somebody realizes that he's dead, but then uses that to try and get revenge. Here, there's no ability to get revenge because he's got no way of interacting with anybody who's alive. So it's a film full of despair there. And there's a amazing quote in the film when he's conversing with another ghost, and the other ghost says to him, "The dead only upset themselves by worrying about the living." And I guess that's really an interesting quote to consider, not just in terms of alive or dead, but just in terms of anything in life that's beyond your control. I mean, you could fret about anything that's going on, about the war in Ukraine, about things that are happening overseas and other tragedies, but often there's not a lot that you yourself can do about it. And yes, you can spend your whole life or a lot of time worrying about it, but it's not going to bring about any resolution. Whereas similarly in Pitfall, it's sort of got that dynamic in there that in as much as he tries to find out what's going on, there's just no way of achieving any sort of resolution. So yeah, it's an incredibly grim film, but very interesting, and very interesting in terms of identity. As we've said before, about accepting his circumstances and sort of recontextualizing his life, sort of coming to grapple with the fact that he is dead, and there have been some other films that I don't want to spoil, which have sort of similar territory about characters trying to grapple with the fact that they died, but you don't find that out till the end. Whereas here, Teshigahara makes it very clear early on, and just it's amazing the reverse footage shot. I actually rewound it and rewatched it again as soon as it happened. Just amazing how smooth it is when he had the reverse back and he sort of goes from being on the ground and standing back up and then staring at his hands as in the letterbox backdrop and realizing that he's dead. It's just an incredible realization in there. But for me, it's very much a trademark Teshigahara film. Even beyond that, you've got that amazing eerie music scored by his regular composer. You've got these great compositions which really capture the texture. You've got the sort of like the cracks on the ground with snakes slithering over it. You've got the muddy river at the end. And you've got some amazing long-distance shots also as he's walking towards the ghost town, where he ultimately gets trapped. And he sounds so happy and sounds so jolly, but just the way the whole thing's shot from a distance and silhouette, you just sort of get this sinking feeling even before he arrives, and not everything is going to quite go to plan.
Yeah, that's really beautifully said. So, and I think I agree on essentially all your points there. And I think just like you said, this fact that he can't actually engage, like it removes any kind of heroism from the story. It removes any kind of traditional action, if you will, from the story. It's just a circle of observing and seeing rather dark things happening around them, and that's very unusual, and it's such a gifted and inspired debut feature. So it's just very impressive to see. I think is a little rough around the edges. Still, like as I thought about, the pacing is a little bit off. I mean, those 25 minutes before he gets killed are very leisurely, but it's such an interesting film. It's just a thoroughly good film. It's so easy to recommend. That stands out in every way. And you know, when he, for instance, he watches the son and he sees him, you know, his son finds his father murdered, and he doesn't cry. He looks through his pockets, he finds some food, and he eats it. And the father is standing from a distance saying, "Oh yes, yes, eat it, eat it." It's those little things like that are also quite heartbreaking, because the father is just happy the son is getting some food. I think it's also a film that kind of dives into extreme poverty in a way too, because you just see this kind of mystery that exists within it, and it's a bit of a social commentary, if you will, in genre trappings that you wouldn't necessarily expect either.
I'm really happy you brought up the son, Chris, because for me that's one of the most interesting characters in the film. I mean, obviously, the man in white is the most intriguing character. Don't want to spoil that too much, but he's definitely the most, curious what's going on with him character. But the son for me is really interesting, because I remember the first time around, I was a bit confused about the son character and why he was in there and why I was sort of getting his perspective. But it's actually really interesting, the stuff that actually is going on with the son. I don't know how much we can spoil the film. Are we able to mention the doppelganger?
Oh, yes, we can mention the doppelganger, sure.
Okay, yeah. So the reason why he's murdered, and I'm pretty sure this is before the halfway mark, but if not, you can sue us for spoiling the film. You do actually find out that the reason why he was murdered was because he was mistaken for another man. And that leads to some really interesting scenes later on where the man who was meant to be killed ends up going to the ghost town to investigate why his double was killed, and then ends up interacting with the woman who lied about who the killer was, and she thinks that he was just pretending to be dead. And then the son sees him, and the son's still in the town wandering around, and then mistakes him for his dad. And for me, the son's, just a really interesting character from that point of view, in that you're not quite sure what he's like. As Chris mentioned, he gets some food out of his dad's pocket and sort of carries on unfazed. And with the whole police investigation before the double comes back and looks for things, I can't remember exactly, but I'm pretty sure at least a day has passed. So you've got this son's been wandering around town. The woman has a candy store, so I guess he's been helping himself to candy. But he's a very interesting character for me because he doesn't seem that traumatized, or maybe he's not processing it properly, but he seems to sort of be able to carry on. He's just carrying on wandering around the town, maybe in a daze, maybe hoping his dad will return. For me, that uncertainty of what exactly that's meant to represent really, I guess, knocked it down a notch the first time I saw it. Second time around, didn't mind it that much, but I guess for me, it's a thing where when I go back and revisit the film again, I'll be trying to work out the exact role of the son in the narrative.
And I think it's worth noting that even the doppelganger doesn't know who would want him killed and why. There's suspicions, but like this kind of uncertainty of why all of this is happening is just kept as a question mark throughout the film. And the mysterious killer, we watch him, we observe him, he's extremely dangerous, but we don't know his motivation. We don't know exactly what he wants to achieve. And our lead doesn't know either. And it is this kind of, it's this frustration, this inability to do anything about his situation, and just lingering in this void, a void we're kind of kept with, no matter what happens, because again, he cannot communicate with anyone else. It's a very distressing film for that reason. And yeah, just a very strong first outing. Do you want to move on to The Face of Another as well?
Yeah, that's fine. I'm happy to move on. Do you want to talk about or introduce the film?
Sure. So The Face of Another is the other film by Teshigahara. I think it's a truly great work. And it's, like we talked about earlier, it's a similar portrait of a lack of certainty in the self of our lead, who has been severely scarred by an accident at work. His face is burnt and he wears bandages at all times. And in meeting with his psychiatrist, he is informed that there is a way to make him a mask that can make him live more normally, but there are certain stipulations with this. And it's a film where once he gets this mask on, he feels like he can do anything. And the psychiatrist is a very strange character in this too, because he seems to be kind of trying to steer him in certain directions and be testing what this kind of mask will do, and be interested in like this kind of duality of the character and creating a new persona. And all throughout this, there is once again this very unnerving energy. We see all of these prosthetic body parts floating in tanks. There's a lot of unusual visuals, and it's again this kind of spiral of a narrative which just goes increasingly down a rabbit hole of no return. And it also has one of my favorite Japanese actors, Tatsuya Nakadai, in the role, with him pretending that his face is a mask, and a mask that becomes more and more lived in, which is a really big feat, if you will, because you kind of see his face as being more plastic-like. This film that manages to be unnerving on just so many levels as it spins this tale, and it's a great testament to both Teshigahara's storytelling abilities, but above all his sense of atmosphere and what can really get under our skin and kind of tingle these little notions in our mind.
I am in agreement with you, Chris, about The Face of Another being Teshigahara's second best film. Although for me, that means it's my all-time top 100, whereas for you, it means it's still outside your top 1,000, but that's fine. We'll improve that with repeat viewings of the film. Maybe it'll improve for you. Yeah, look, you've done a really great job summarizing a lot of what makes the film so great. And I guess what I like so much about it myself is those personal identity questions. And you got a lot of dialogue that's very pointed in this regard. Some of the conversations include such comments as getting drunk might well be in a mask of itself, and that in love we try to unmask each other. So you sort of get this constantly flowing through the film that we're sort of looking at the face and how much we use the face to determine who a person is. And there's a great part where he walks into his office with the bandages on for the first part early on, and he actually scolds the secretary for telling her off and saying that he could have been anybody. Why didn't she stop and check who he is? And she's like, well, I know it was you. And he's like, it could be anybody under the mask. But then he's sort of forgetting about the voice. But a lot of it is about how obsessed he gets with his facial appearance. And a lot of the film's also about how untrusting he is of his wife. I mean, the film almost for me has Othello-like turns to it. He's just absolutely obsessed with this idea that his wife is only pretending to be sympathetic towards him, that she doesn't really love him without his face on there, and that she's only saying things to be nice to him. And a lot of it is about him wanting to test out and call out his wife. And for me, that's maybe what stands out the most about the film, about how obsessed he gets about this. And he agrees to this wacky face molding plan from the psychiatrist in order to be able to test out this theory that his wife would be unfaithful with somebody who's got a proper face if she had the chance. Something which you mentioned, which I also totally agree with also, Chris, is that it's a lot about the confidence that he gets. He actually finds this newfound confidence with having this other person's face on, and he feels he can go out and do different things and be undetected. So he sort of becomes a bit more adventurous with stuff that he does. And then when he finds out that other people have got ways of reading him beyond the face, that really gets to him. Like there's this girl who's possibly mentally handicapped or neurodivergent. It's not quite made clear, but she manages to realize that he's the same person, even though she once sees him with bandages and then later sees him without the bandages on, with somebody else's face on. So it's sort of that playing around in his mind. Am I ever really mask myself? Am I really another person? And sort of that power drive that he gets to it. So, okay, I'm probably rambling on at the moment. So I might flick back to you, Chris. There's a few other things I want to discuss, but we'll see if you bring them up first.
Yeah, I think you bring up a lot of interesting points there, Saul. And yeah, it's definitely a focus on what's in the face. I mean, that could be the central thesis to the film, if you will, because he has these conversations with his wife about, like the importance of the face. For a while when he's burned, he talks about this kind of hypocrisy around, or this kind of weird mental hang-ups people have about faces. But once he obviously gets the face himself, he genuinely believes he is a different person, or he genuinely believes that, like you said, that people shouldn't be able to recognize him no matter what. It's this kind of simultaneous thrill, but also, I suppose, personal confusion of identity in that kind of freedom, as his doctor puts it, and keeps pushing. And it's essentially, a lot of the film is just seeing him kind of test the waters, and also testing the waters of his new identity. And also the most unnerving part about the film to me is just the way that it's really the doctor that's kind of pushing it throughout, because he has this vision of what this mask should do, what kind of impact it should have. And he's just really, really interested in seeing this play out. His sets are really up for even more psychological exhaustion that might otherwise have been necessary, and it's a bit of a power play between them two that I don't want to spoil too much, but that does lead certain places as the film progresses.
Okay, so a couple of other points I'll just mention briefly before asking about something else is that you did mention before all the body limbs sort of floating around the doctor's office, or the way they seem to be with how they're positioned. The Art Deco, the whole way the doctor's surgery is lit up, and the room that he's in, and you've sort of got that iconic shot of him going in front of this outline of a face, and how his sort of like face gets superimposed on top of that. Yeah, for me, that's all the visuals, and it's things that Teshigahara would build up in his other films to come, where you sort of got these characters that are obscured by things in the foreground, and we're sort of viewing things from a more voyeuristic angle. And there's also a great part where him and his doctor are in a restaurant, and the lights just sort of dim at one point as they start getting into a really intense conversation about the mask that we all wear. And just one other point which I do want to make is just the makeup job is amazing. It's hard to believe this film is, I guess we're approaching 60 years old. We'll be 60 years old soon, and the makeup is just incredible. I mean, there's a part towards the end where you've sort of got him breaking down and emoting, and his mask is sort of like half hanging off his face, and it just actually really adds to the performance, the makeup, and sort of the distorted makeup has sort of begun to rip it off, but it's not fully off. So that for me is sort of one of the most haunting images, or actually another haunting image, and I was going to keep it brief, but another haunting image, and it's the letterbox background again for the film, is him looking out at a construction site and how he's sort of like viewing that being partially constructed and not fully made. And that scene comes as him and his doctor go to meet with the person who's going to donate the face. So for me, that's one of the most interesting scenes because it's him looking at the construction or looking at sort of the middle result rather than thinking about the end result of what will happen once his face actually does get constructed. So I absolutely love the symbolism in there. One of the issues which does seem to get pointed out when people talk about this not being as good as Woman of the Dunes is the fact that you've got these extra scenes in there with an unrelated young woman who's got some facial scarring. And for me, the first time round that I watched the film, that did take me a little bit out of the main story also. But the more that I've rewatched the film, or I've watched it 2 more times since, I've actually really liked the way that sort of punctuates the story. We've got this contrast in there with a young woman who's also got facial scarring and the different ways that her life takes turns because of that. So I was just wondering on what your take were on those extra scenes involving the unrelated young woman and her facial scarring.
Yeah, that was, I guess, perhaps one of the things that brought the film down a little bit for me. Not necessarily down, but it felt like she was there as a balancing act, and that it was more for kind of broader picture or like this kind of broader sense of what the movie is about, this kind of importance of the face, this kind of importance of facial scarring and how people see you. It worked, but yeah, it was just, they could have been cut from the film. I don't think they would have had a big impact for me personally.
Well, if they did cut it from the film, it would make it a lot shorter, which would probably help you with all the pacing issues that you seem to have with Teshigahara.
I don't think this film necessarily has a lot of pacing issues. I think like the way he films them, the way he shoots them, he builds psychological tension, but sometimes it's just a little bit too leisurely for me because I don't think he has that kind of same overtly visual intensity at all times as some of the other directors who do this kind of film or kind of does things leisurely. But that's more of an issue for his later films, to be honest. I think that these 3 first films in black and white, I mean, they look great. And the visual tension is much higher in these 3 black and white films than in his later works, in my opinion.
Okay, there's just one more thing with The Face of Another, which I thought I'd bring up. This is really interesting because going by the letterbox summary of the film, it says a businessman with a disfigured face obtains a lifelike mask from his doctor, but the mask starts altering his personality. Now that's the summary on Letterboxd, and I've actually read a few other reviews that go to that same effect and sort of blame the mask itself for his personality changes. And I've seen the film 3 times and I've never read it like that. For me, the film is always about the confidence boost he gets from him being able to walk around with his face not being there, or from people not being able to see the real him. It gives him more confidence, like I mentioned before, like getting drunk. So it's that sort of confidence which I think changes him rather than the mask itself. But I was just wondering what your thoughts were on it. Also, I had somebody who liked my Letterboxd review, and then in the review said the film was all like Frankenstein, which I still can't really get my head around. Although he said the guy was burnt and the monster's afraid of fire or something like that. So just wondering, Chris, on your takes on whether there are really Frankenstein parallels in there, and whether it can be read that the mask actually has a will of its own and it's affecting his personality, or whether the letterbox summary needs to be rewritten.
That's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I don't think the mask is any kind of like magical mask that has a mind of its own, but I do think that the application of the mask and the kind of these kind of constant implications from his doctor does make him think of the mask as a way of putting on another personality and be another person. And with or without magic, that is kind of the effect that the mask starts to have long term. And yes, he's so asking me if I have seconds rated higher than Fate's Another. And yes, I do. Seconds is actually one of I consider Seconds a masterpiece. So yeah, it's I do prefer it. It's a similar film though, like you said, and it's a very unnerving film as well. I think perhaps even more visceral in some ways, if you will. That's a fantastic film. I would be happy to discuss that in another podcast.
I was just going to apologize. I know it's a very out there thing to just throw out, but it is a film that's often mentioned side by side with Face of Another. And they're both from 1966. They've both got that sort of idea of having somebody else's face on. And I do have Seconds rated higher up, but both of them are all-time top 50 films for me. So I do like Seconds a bit more. It's a little bit more visual. The ending's a little bit more haunting. But for me, both of them are great. So we should do a Seconds podcast at some stage. But I'll let you respond to the Frankenstein stuff.
Yeah, we'll be on for a second podcast. Yeah, I share your thoughts as well. Like both really great films, but Seconds it's just a few steps above it in just how unnerving it gets. I think I can see more similarities with the Frankenstein novels than the Frankenstein films, because in the novel, Frankenstein is this medical student that creates a very intelligent monster who starts to haunt him in certain ways and has this kind of very much a psychological will of its own, as opposed to the movies where the Frankenstein monster is more of this more innocent creature. But in this film, the Doctor character is far more sinister and far, like it's often said that Frankenstein is a real monster in the Frankenstein story, not the monster himself. But here in this film, there's a good case that the Doctor is a very villainous character. He's certainly out to imbalance our lead and to push him down certain paths. And he's a very nefarious character, and it's interesting to just watch him and see like to what extent he might succeed. And with that, it might make sense to move on to A Man Without a Map, which is the only Teshigahara film I actually haven't rewatched for this podcast. So this will be more of a solo soul session.
So rewatching Man Without a Map after almost a decade with much lower expectations, I actually found I really enjoyed it. It's not One of the Dunes level, it's not Face of Another level, but for me, it's on a similar level to Pitfall. The film involves a businessman who mysteriously vanishes without a trace and a private detective who loses his grip on reality while trying to solve the mystery. It does feel very different from the previous three Teshigahara films, mostly I'd say because it's shot in color. However, Teshigahara does some amazing stuff with color inversion in there and with different effects and using the color in there. So he uses color very effectively. And it still actually has a great music score by Toru Takemitsu. Okay, I've tried to pronounce it that time. So for me, it still feels like a Teshigahara film, but obviously it feels very different to his Fingerprint trilogy, which are all in stark black and white. The film does require some patience, and it is more leisurely paced than the previous three films, so Chris is probably not likely to like it as much, but it's just really interesting the mystery he gets involved in, because even though he's been hired to try and find this man who's gone missing, everybody is very uncooperative. They don't want to give him many facts. They have no interest in finding out where the man is. Anybody who he talks to only want to find out why he vanished. Which really annoys the detective because he's not there to try and determine the psychology of why this man would walk out of his life. He's there to try and locate him. And it is quite interesting because it sort of reflects a little bit on the detective's life himself, because the detective also walked out on his wife, and he even has a part where he goes and he chats to his wife, and it's like, well, how different is this to how you walked out of our marriage? What really makes it a Teshigahara film for me is that it builds on what The Face of Another did with the whole obscuring of objects. As I mentioned, objects and faces. As I mentioned it before, there's this great shot. We've got two people and they're framed through a glass cabinet, so you can't see them properly. You've also got a lot of wine glasses and other alcohol glasses that are put down in front of the detective's face, and suddenly it's like looking through a funhouse mirror. You get this whole sort of distorted reflection. There's also an amazing part where he sits down at a table. It's at a bar that's totally empty. He's conversing with a waitress, but all that we can see of him is his face reflected down on a table. So we're going to see his distorted reflection in the glass of the table. So a lot of it for me is Teshigahara really playing around with the way that you can frame action and the way that he constantly distorts these characters' face, the way that the action isn't quite properly shown. There's a part where he's driving along in his car and we're seeing not him driving in his car, but we're seeing him in the mirrored reflection of these tall glass buildings. So it's like everything's refracted, everything's distorted, which really fits in with the mystery that he's trying to solve. And the mystery is, again, it's Teshigahara territory. It's the whole identity crisis that you've got this man who's decided to give up and walk out of his life and find something different. Yeah, very similar to Pitfall, very similar to Woman of the Dunes. The only difference is at this time you've got somebody investigating that, but I guess at the same time also getting a bit lost in the process, and things really get into his mental headspace towards the end, to the point where it gets a little bit surreal. And yeah, I don't know there's really much more I can say beyond that, other than I'd highly recommend checking it out, Chris, because I had this down as a mild disappointment, because at the time that I'd watched it, I'd actually already seen the other Teshigahara films. I was on holiday in Hong Kong and managed to get his last two films on DVD. So it was just this one, because I think it was music rights, or how many music rights? Oh no, I think it was translation rights. There was some it got hold up for release because there was some rights issue with the translation of the subtitles, so it couldn't get released with English subtitles. So this was the last Teshigahara film that I saw. He made it in between Face of Another and Summer Soldier, so my expectations were sky high, so I'm not surprised I was disappointed. But rewatching it recently, I was just like, wow, I can't believe how much I dismissed this at the time, because yes, it feels different because it's a color Teshigahara film, but in every other way, it's what he does best.
Yeah, that's a really good sell. I might end up rewatching it at some point. Is it restored now, by the way? Because the version I saw, I think, was like a relatively weak DVD version.
Okay, I'm probably not the best person to ask about that. We'll see if the Image Quality podcast gets released before this one does. But I'm not too big on image quality, so I think acceptable quality, but acceptable for me is pretty much 360 or above, because I was watching it on my iPad. So I don't know. It's not a 4K restoration, so Tom's never going to see it. But it might have been 720. I just can't remember offhand.
All right. I don't mind 720. I think that if there's ever a proper Blu-ray restoration, I might give it a rewatch, just because a lot of the tension that Teshigahara manages to create with his visuals are just from how they are composed, and when that quality is a bit lower, some of the power is probably lost. I don't actually remember that much from The Man Without a Map. I thought it was a decent film. I think it's like a lot of Teshigahara films. I think it started off quite well, but I slowly started to lose a bit of interest, which is something I'll say about a lot of the films coming up as well. That's the issue I have with most of his color films, sadly. But no, I mean, it was well shot. It played into a lot of his ideas of playing with the self. I thought it was an interesting, perfectly decent film. But yeah, for me, it's one of his weakest. And let's see if I change my mind on a rewatch. But with that, it might make sense to go on to a film I really, really like. And I think I might actually like about as much as Soul, as Summer Soldier, which is one of those very, very rare Japanese films that is largely in English with an American lead. It follows a soldier on leave from the Vietnam War who decides to desert because he doesn't want to go back to the fighting. He has taken up with a woman who's hiding him, and he gets introduced to an anti-military organization that starts to hide him. But he's by no means an angel. He's a very off-putting character in many ways, and the film kind of just follows his kind of journey of trying to evade captivity, the reaction from the Japanese people helping him, and also, I suppose you could say, somewhat perhaps random interviews
with soldiers is this kind of almost documentary feel that kind of sets the tone and tension for the film as we follow him. It's a very different film, I would say, from most of Teshigahara's other work. It still plays with the sense of self and who he is, as he kind of tries to deny that he is a deserter, and he kind of starts to, I suppose you could say, invent a new character for himself, or the way he's presenting himself and the way he really is. And it's a very interesting film for that. It's also just a very interesting film for all the things mentioned above. The focus on U.S. military in Japan, the focus against the Vietnam War, this kind of rather leisurely pace again of just this man existing and trying to escape. There's a lot of things going on here that there's a lot of things to read into the film. There's a lot of things to dive into. So I would love to hear your thoughts on it, Sol.
So, Summer Soldiers is my least favorite of Teshigahara's first 6 films, but I do think it is a generally great film. The key for me in processing it is really thinking about the fact that 12 years elapsed between Summer Soldiers and the Gaudi documentary that he did in the 80s. So for me, when I was rewatching it, I was really thinking about it as a pre-hiatus film, and that made it incredibly interesting because of what the protagonist is like in Summer Soldiers. He's a war deserter, and when he's trying to make it around in himself in the world, you've got everybody still trying to pigeonhole him. He's trying to get some help from these Japanese people who are sympathetic to war deserters, but only if they're ideological. And his girlfriend's actually with him, and she's asking, well, he hates war, isn't that enough? And they're like, no, he needs to be ideological. He needs to actually not just be deserting, but it needs to be, for a reason, he needs to be anti-military. And I guess for me, I see it about a film about somebody trying to escape being pigeonholed, and I'm wondering if maybe Teshigahara felt a little bit like that at the time. He sort of made these 4 masterpieces in the 1960s that are very visually intense, got this common music score, got these common themes in terms of identity, and maybe as a filmmaker, Teshigahara at this point, maybe he wanted to branch out. I don't know that much because I haven't read that much about him. Not as much has been written about Teshigahara compared to the other Japanese masters of his time. But for me, it was very interesting as a pre-hiatus piece. And something that Chris mentioned is that the main guy isn't very likable. And I would agree with that. But I found that really interesting because you've sort of got those shots earlier on where he's hiding in the shadows. He's cowering when somebody knocks on his girlfriend's door because he doesn't know if it's the police and he's going to be dragged away. But as the film progresses and the police actually visit his girlfriend's place so they don't catch him, he actually grows very cocky and arrogant. And you sort of got that progression there from being this timid and, nervous deserter to this person going, oh, well, I can do what I want with the world. And he does do some really awful things. Trying to blackmail a couple who are giving him shelter for money and sort of like marrying to have this money to be able to take out a woman. And it's just sort of what he's doing with his life is not really that honorable. So it's a very interesting position to have. You've sort of got this character who's deserted, but it's not actually ideological. It's not so much that he hates or even though that's what he's saying, it's just he doesn't want to be doing that with his life. He's a young man, he wants to be out, I guess he wants to be romancing women, he wants to be having a good time, and he's trying to get out of that pigeonholing. So for me, as a Teshigahara film, yeah, look, I was trying to look for bits and pieces that do seem like what I'm used to seeing from him. That part hiding in the shadows at the beginning was a lot like that. They've got some driving scenes and some shots at night that remind me a little bit of Man Without a Map, especially with the way that Teshigahara uses color. But it does feel less like a signature piece to me than his first 4 films and his 6th film that we're discussing afterwards. So that for me is what holds it back a little bit, but I do think it is a genuinely great film.
Yeah, so you might like the film slightly more than me then, because it's my 3rd or 4th favorite Teshigahara. It's about the same place as Pitfall for me. I really enjoyed the atmospheric build-up. I actually really loved the first 20 to 30 minutes where you kind of have his very damaged relationship with his lover. You kind of looking at, okay, how genuine is he in this? And you find out later that, okay, it's probably not that genuine, let's say. I did think that once, it's kind of about him on the run, and it's just lots of shots of him just walking about, evading capture, having a character gallery that's not necessarily that exciting. I thought it kind of lost some steam there, though there is this one scene, which I don't want to spoil too much about the host family that's brought him in, and how he engages with him and just expects things from them, and just starts to become rather abusive. That is really, really strong as well. I think it's a very good film. I think that it has a very balanced and nuanced and interesting approach. It plays into similar, like kind of the psychologically draining idea of just, are we sympathetic with this character or not? Are we sympathetic about his overall situation? How do you feel about soldiers trying to escape Vietnam? Like you mentioned, so like the character like asking him, like, is that enough that he doesn't want to fight? Like, should we help anyone who doesn't want to kill people, or like, should he have any kind of moral reason for doing so? And like, I guess it's a question throughout the film is like, why is he deserting? And yeah, it's just like I said earlier, just so many things going on in the film and in this person's mind, and the way that Teshigahara kind of explores it makes it a very fascinating and unusual portrayal.
The only other thing which I thought I'd mention is the parts that you referred to earlier on, Chris, where you've got these cutaways to other soldiers talking to the camera, sort of in documentary style. That, for me, I actually really liked the second time round. The first time round, it was a little bit jarring for me. But for me, it's very similar to the cutaways to the young woman with the scarred face in The Face of Another. So you've sort of got this parallel plot line, or sort of these cutaway scenes, but they add to the texture of it because you get this soldier giving his reasonings for how he feels about the war. And it helps us to sort of try and fill in the blanks, or maybe not fill in the blanks, or wonder whether the protagonist actually does fit into those blanks at all. But yeah, for me, there's a lot going on there. It's not an all-time Teshigahara favorite, but as you said, Chris, I guess maybe because I'm looking in the context of his entire career as a pre-hiatus film, I possibly did like it slightly more than you.
And with that, I might move to the film that we have the biggest gulf between us on, which is Antonio Gaudi, a documentary about the Catalan architect by the same name. And it's a really fascinating and bold, almost experimental documentary, as there's almost no dialogue or interviews in it. I think the first dialogue from any kind of interviewees comes in about 30 minutes in, and there's probably less than 2-3 minutes of dialogue throughout. Almost all of the film is just shots of the buildings and parks that Gaudi designed, and it's visually beautiful and interesting. Teshigahara managed to do several very nice compositions. The way he shoots through it has this kind of curiosity about it, of how this looks, because obviously for those who are remotely familiar with him, and even those who aren't and just watch this, Gaudi has a very unusual way of approaching design, and his buildings does not look traditional, let's say. And yeah, it's just Teshigahara just trusts that the buildings and the designs speak for themselves. I was overall sadly not that impressed, but I know you are. So I'm going to let you talk a bit about this film first, and then I'll come into my negativity later on.
So I think Antonio Gaudi is a film that's going to disappoint anybody going into it, hoping to find out more about Gaudi. Like you mentioned, Chris, there are a few parts in there quite late into the film where there's a little bit of dialogue, and you've got a part where a few academics sit around to discuss his work. And for me, those are the weakest parts of the film. The parts of the film that really work for me are the ones where Teshigahara lets the images do the talking. And he's just got this absolutely amazing way of photographing all these structures and all these paintings. You see all these paintings and they're zoomed in, all these drawings, and they're zoomed in, and it starts in a close-up, and then the camera pans up or it pans down or it gradually zooms out to reveal more detail. And it's just a very deliberate way. Everything for me felt very deliberate with the way that Teshigahara was filming it. You've got all of these shots that are looking around the architecture, and it's very voyeuristic. It's not just straight shots. The camera's often moving and often showing us things from angles that you wouldn't really look at. It's almost like a childlike wonder looking up at some of these structures in place. And some of the structures are just remarkable. I mean, Teshigahara made his name based on his treatment of surfaces and structures. And you've got that going through again. I mean, you can see how much he loves Gaudi's work because of how textured it is, because of all the unusual structures. And for me, it really sits alongside, maybe not Summer Soldiers, but his first four films really well as a sort of look at how the world can be seen a little bit differently. The film also has a very characteristically disquieting music score from Toru Takemitsu, if I pronounce that correctly. So for me, it's not a narrative film, so it does feel very different, I guess, to the first four Teshigahara films, but it does really sit alongside there for me. It's one of those films where you really feel that you get this love of texture and a love of constructions that Teshigahara really likes. And also his framing is really interesting. I mean, there are some seemingly random shots of people dancing around bonfires and of people, I think, dancing in the street and sitting around bonfires. But just the way that he films and the way that he frames, and you sort of like just see the feet or you just see the heads, it still feels that Teshigahara is... Anyway, the only other comment that I'll probably make over there is that you do see human beings passing through us. It's not just empty areas. And that, again, made me think about some of the identity stuff and how you relate to yourself in the world. And you sort of see these, I don't want to say normal looking, but average looking people against these amazing structures. And again, it sort of puts into context what the world can sometimes look like. So maybe I'm rambling a little bit, but for me, it really spoke to me as a Teshigahara film. And I really loved how unusual it was in presentation.
Yeah, that's really good sell. So I wish I was appreciating the film the same way you did. And I think you're very, very right that you can kind of see just how much he loves this architect he's drawn in by his style. For me, it really just felt like, yes, you can feel that he loves Gaudi's style. You kind of get almost a personality from a lot of these buildings, which is really interesting to see. But when it's just shot this way, I didn't feel like it had the same kind of symphonic feel that many City Symphony films have. For instance, I don't think he did enough with the soundscape to make it more grand. I think he just let the images speak for themselves, and it just felt a little bit flat to me, to be honest, over time. It felt a bit like, I mean, I went back and I found my original review from when I saw it about a decade ago, and it was exactly the same feeling I have on this rewatch, which is that it kind of feels like really talented, well-executed vacation footage, which is putting it very crassly, because I do think it's a very well-made film. But I just did not get the proper drive from it. And I was also rather frustrated by the interviews, if you can call them that. Like 30 minutes in, there's about 10-20 seconds of someone just adding a quick note. And it just felt really out of place. Like once it's going for this kind of completely, like almost non-interview style, where it just lets the buildings speak for themselves. I would rather he just went for that, or incorporated something a bit closer to a traditional documentary, because those scenes did not work that well for me.
That's entirely fine, Chris, and I do agree about the interview sections or parts where people were talking. That for me were the weakest parts of the film, and that's why it's like on a rung below Man Without a Map and Pitfall for me. That's why it's only my fifth favorite and not maybe a top three favorite film. But I mean, I get what you're saying. I mean, I'm thinking about the opening of Manhattan when you've got all that rising Gershwin music over all the buildings of Manhattan. I'm thinking, well, yes, the film could have been like that, but I do like what Teshigahara opted for. And you do have those bursts of Takemitsu music heard, and it's just very, very realistic. I mean, I think what I wrote in my review about it is that you sort of feel like a trespasser as you're wandering through these almost alien-looking constructions. And it's only every so often when you see somebody dancing, you see somebody walking outside a building, you actually remember that this is actually a real structure as part of the real world. And just really fits into me with all the films that Teshigahara has done about different environments, unusual and alien environments. Everything from the ghost town in Pitfall to the area downside the dunes and Woman of the Dunes to the doctor's office in Face of Another. For me, it was enough of a Teshigahara film that I was able to appreciate it at least.
And you're clearly not alone. Like I said, it ended up on our top 250 Japanese films back in 2021. And I think it has a lot of fans. So if anything, I'm a bit of an outlier. But do you have anything else to add on Antonio Gaudi?
I don't think so. I mean, I pretty much summed it up. I mean, it's not a narrative film. You're not going to get a story in there which is quite as juicy as the one in Woman of the Dunes or Face of Another. But as a look at Teshigahara bringing his trademark style to a non-narrative film, I think for anybody who's enjoyed his first 5 films, it's something that I would recommend. Although based on what Chris has said, I'd recommend maybe with some caution.
Yeah, that might be good to say. I recommend it with some caution because, clearly it's a film that's beloved by many, but it might also be a specific niche of people. So as more people seek out Antonio Gaudi, let's see how the opinions stack up. But overall, yeah, it's clearly a respected film. And this actually brings us up to Teshigahara's last 2 films, which is a duology of Rikyu, which is the film I mentioned earlier, was nominated for Best Japanese Films at the Japanese version of the Academy Awards, and Princess Go, its sequel. And we can talk about Rikyu first. We can talk about them separately because I know that both Saul and I have a particularly negative reaction to the last of these 2. But at least for me, Rikyu is a pretty good film. It's well acted. It centers on intriguing matters of the court, and it's an interesting film because our lead, Rikyu, is the tea master, and we see the story of how important the tea ceremony is within this kind of feudal society of Japan, within samurai culture, within politics, even geopolitics with the Portuguese traders, and just how this extremely important position and these ceremonies are used. One of the most interesting things in this is how Teshigahara, in this kind of leisurely focus on specific actions that I mentioned earlier, shoots these tea ceremonies with very little dialogue, capturing the essence of them, capturing the atmosphere, simply showing people pour the tea, and as the film continues, building more and more extravagant kind of places to have tea. It's a very serene film. It doesn't have this kind of more trippy elements as his earlier works. It's more down to earth, perhaps more conventional in some ways, but it still has the same kind of Teshigahara focus of this kind of stream of consciousness as a character is, like Saul mentioned earlier, a character is kind of uncertain about their identity and their place in the world and what they should do. And there's a lot of interesting personal dynamics involved as our lead kind of has to navigate his personal beliefs of what the tea ceremony should represent and the whims of his lord.
So we've reached the part of the podcast where we're talking about the 2 Teshigahara films that I'm not too big on. I mean, Chris has done a pretty good job selling the worthwhile points about Rikyu. It's a decent enough film, and I do think it's a good film, but for me, it feels very restrained as a Teshigahara film, especially considering that only 5 years earlier he did the very voyeuristic Antonio Gaudi documentary. There are Teshigahara touches in there. You've got these characters who are framed looking through translucent screens. You've got some mirror reflection distortion, but most of the film seems to be concentrated on the story itself. And the story itself is not uninteresting. You've got this tea master, you've got this warlord, who really, really respects this tea master, even though he's like a lower class citizen. He really respects him because he's a master of the tea making craft, and he can't get over the fact that the tea master doesn't believe that his plans of invading China, his warmongering plans, are worthwhile. And that really gets him in the bind that the tea master can't agree with him, which really sets up a lot of the drama. So that in itself is kind of interesting. You've sort of got the relationship between the two men. Probably the most interesting part for me of the film, though, is there's this gigantic globe of the world, which you see the warlord playing with. And he's sort of like playing with it and throwing it up in the air. And that just whenever I see it, I've only seen the film twice, but both times that I saw the film, it really brought to mind for me Jackie Oki in The Great Dictator throwing a globe of the world up in the air as he's thinking about his plans for invading Europe. And I guess for me, that illusion sort of really carries force through, that he's got these childish, whimsical plans for invading the world that might not really be all that sensible, and you just want to take advice on whether they really are sensible or not. So look, as a narrative, there's quite a bit in there, but I'll probably go to a criticism and just say that for me it did drag out. It's a 2.5-hour film, and yes, one of the dunes is also 2 hours, but one of the dunes passes by in a flash, or not really a flash, but it passes by quite swiftly, whereas Rikyu, everything's really dragged out. I guess because Teshigahara really wants us to get invested in the story, but for me the story wasn't quite as gripping as the personal identity studies that he made his name with. So yeah, it's a decent film, but it's not a film that I would really highly recommend. I did actually have it a bit high rated up the first time I saw it, but the first time I saw it, I was so excited to see it. I'd got this rare DVD of it from Hong Kong because it hadn't been released anywhere in the Western world. I was looking, going, "Oh, I can see that. It looks like a Teshigahara film here, there, and there." And yes, there are parts like that where you can see his trademarks in there, but the overall narrative for me just isn't as strong as the films that he really made his name with.
Yeah, I'll agree with that, and I'll side with your criticism as well. It does drag out, and that is the real reason why I don't love this film. I just like it. I think it has really strong performances. I think the drama within it is good. It had a lot of potential to step up, but the way Teshigahara kind of shoots it is like it lacks a little bit of tension. It lacks the kind of tension that he was able to add to, in particular, his 3 first films. And I suppose this is partially because it doesn't have the striking black and white. It's still a very beautifully made film, but it doesn't have this kind of black and white intensity of his first 3. And it, like Sol mentioned also, it doesn't kind of have this kind of more psychological elements to it. And that's obviously should be fine. A director should be able to branch out and do other types of stories. I do think that if a different director had taken Rikyu's material, they could have made a more visually intense film. Which is not to knock Teshigahara, he did a good job. It's a good film, very well acted, very well shot. It's just not one of his very best. And if you move on to his last film, Princess Go, I think that's your least favorite in total, right, Sol?
Yeah, look, I did like Princess Go a little bit more this time, but I would agree that it's his weakest by far.
I don't want to spoil the events of Rikyu, but this film essentially takes up more or less just as the first film ended. We're introduced to new lead characters, and I think I had a similar reaction to Rikyu, where I at first was very engaged by it because one of Tatsuya Nakadai is back in a Teshigahara film. He's very strong in this film, and a lot of the early scenes are focused on him and setting up his character, and that part was really interesting to me. It was his dynamics with the Lord, and I felt there was a lot of tension. It's once again a very well shot film, but then, at least to me, the film started being too sprawling. It skips
a lot of time. We're introduced to Princess Go, our lead. There's multiple other characters in the mix. It's still kind of continuing the story of Rikyu in a few ways. Which kind of feels like there's these little small things that's just added across the narrative. As a whole, I just felt that it was a bit too thin. I thought it could have been far more tense. I thought the characters could have been stronger. I thought they spent too little time with each of them. It was just lacking a little bit of focus, and the Princess Go character just is not that exciting. And she's in two different iterations as well. You have her both as this kind of very spunky, carefree, almost like at one point almost action hero, and then you have her more as this more very muted leader years later. And a lot could have been done by that, but I don't think that Teshigahara really managed to balance it out well. It's still a decent film. It's not a terrible way to go out, but it doesn't really compare well to his previous efforts.
I think you've done a pretty good job there, Chris, with summing up Princess Go. I would say, yeah, as a narrative for me, it did feel a little bit weak. For a film that's named after, it's actually not a lot of it's about her. A lot of it's about characters reconciling the events of the previous film, which for me, I guess, felt like a bit of a misstep because the film doesn't really feel its own product. It felt very indebted to me, to the previous movie. And yes, that sometimes happens with sequels, but in this case, it just felt that the actual narrative itself about Princess Go didn't really take off until quite a bit in there. What you mentioned about seeing the two different iterations of her is very true. We are seeing her as this spunky young girl with this like crazy hairstyle, and then we see her later on as very complacent. And I think the progression in there is really interesting. It's almost the opposite of Summer Soldiers. We've got this character is very timid and scared, going to be very out there, and I don't care sort of attitude. And with the Princess Go character, it's the reverse of that, but there isn't the gradual progression of Summer Soldiers because, like you said, Chris, it skips months and years at a time. So the narrative cohesion just really isn't there. But what I did write about in my review of the film when I rewatched it is you don't really watch Teshigahara films for the story. Yes, for some of the ideas with personal identity, yes, but mainly I watch a Teshigahara movie for the visuals and for the atmosphere that he builds out. And the visuals are there. There's a really striking, I don't know if it's meant to be a tunnel, but there's like this walkway that's made out of straw, and you see these two male characters walking through it, and they're just like semi-obscured. It's as they're walking through, just seeing bits and pieces of them, which is a really cool image. And we get another version of that later on with our Princess Go going through it. You sort of just see bits and pieces of sunlight streaming down on her face, and that for me is a great image. There's also characters who are obscured by tall grass. There's some slow rotating shots. There's some flames and snow, and it's really interesting to see what Teshigahara does with those weather things compared to Rikyu, which was mainly set indoors. He really has some interesting shots of fire and shots in the snow, and you also see some close-ups of rope dropping against the ground. So his fascination with surfaces and textures is really there. Just the narrative itself isn't there. The themes are interesting. They're not really classic Teshigahara themes as much, but you've got some ideas there about illness. There's an interesting quote there. When ill, people speak nonsense, and you get this idea that people aren't making good choices because illness is interfering with their judgment. You've also got some ideas of the old generation being replaced or forced out, which does make the film a rather fitting swan song. So I guess for me, I saw Summer Soldiers as a pre-hiatus piece. As a swan song piece, it's not a bad way for Teshigahara to go out, but in terms of mounting a haunting narrative, and in terms of a film which is a real audio-visual song on the senses, it doesn't really make the mark for me, which unfortunately, even though I liked it more this time around, does make it a disappointing end to a really illustrious career.
Yeah, well put. I don't think I have too much to add to that, to be honest. I mean, personally, I would have preferred it if Teshigahara had stayed a little bit closer to his roots and maybe gone out with something a bit more trippy and visual. But people change, people age, people get different interests, and I think the fact that he went out with his duology, which has a lot of qualities. Both films are very well acted, very well shot. He was able to tap into something else, and Rikyu in particular, I think, has a decent audience. I mean, I think that in Japan it was quite successful. Like I mentioned, it was nominated for the Japanese Academy Awards. I think that that's a film that many of our listeners might enjoy even more than Soul and myself. And I think that even with Princess Go, which both of us had a somewhat negative reaction to, I think that's a film that many might also like more than us. So yeah, definitely not a bad way to go out, though he didn't exactly go out with a bang. Not sure if we can end this episode with a bang either, so do you have anything, any final words you want to say?
The only other thing I might mention is that I've always felt with Teshigahara, although maybe less so these days with internet streaming and people uploading things to archive.com. That's actually where I saw The Man Without a Map. Availability for me or marketing of his films was something which I was always wondering about when I was first getting into his movies, I guess going back around 15 years ago. I mean, the first Teshigahara film I saw was War of the Dunes because it's the first one that everybody sees because it's the most heavily promoted. And it wasn't until I saw Face of Another and that I was blown away by it that I went back and I rewatched War of the Dunes and I sought out Pitfall and I sought out as many films of his that I could see. Teshigahara feels like a director that hasn't quite been as praised as much as he could have been. I guess due to availability issues, it didn't help that there were subtitle rights with the translation for Man Without a Map. Doesn't help that Summer Soldiers is still very hard to find out. But for me, I did make the Tarkovsky comparison early on. He's a director with similarly very small output. But even though I'm not really big on Teshigahara's last two films, he directed quality films throughout a very small but very impressive career. So he's a director who I would like to see reappraised in the future. I don't know if it's going to happen, but I think for anybody who is impressed with Woman of the Dunes and Face of Another, yes, none of his other films are anywhere near as good as those, but they've all got interesting qualities to them, and I would recommend seeking them out.
So yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I think that Woman in the Dunes and Face of Another are the two standouts for him. Both are great films. If you have seen one and not the other, please seek it out. But yes, he has made many more very good films. Pitfall is definitely one you should seek out. Summer Soldier for me. And obviously Saul will push Man Without a Map and Antonio Gaudi. And yeah, I mean, Antonio Gaudi is a film that people love. I'm not gonna try to hold it back. If our description stuff it sound good to you, you should definitely seek it out. And to give a personal plug, feel free to seek out any of our other episodes as well. We have quite a big library diving into various directors, films, and general topics. So until next time, thank you so much for listening, and join us again soon. You have been listening to Talking Images, the official podcast of icmforum.com.